Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is a redux of a paper that I've written, and that paper is part of a two-part project, one part being the paper itself, and then an ongoing conversation with two people working in the field of climate change mitigation. What the paper talks about is this idea of the decentered human within the Anthropocene, but not from the point of view of the anxiety economy, but from a point of view that appreciates that the mechanisms that have taken us to this point in history are actually quite complex and deeply entrenched. So what we're dealing with here is quite an old problem, but despite the narrative of the 21st century dystopian malaise that you find in things like The Guardian, from a historical perspective, we can say that within the dominant cultural logic we live in, humans are fundamentally economic units. And in light of this, given that potential climate collapse is fundamentally a human problem, we can ascertain from that this kind of collapse is an economic problem that requires first and foremost economic solutions. There's not much going on here that isn't clearly a logical trajectory of the past few hundred years. It's just that right now we seem to be at the arc of a story. We're not the only set of humans to feel that we have an arc in our story, but this one, given what we know, seems particularly pertinent. So I'm going to be looking at this in the framework of Western humanism, along with a mode of thinking called inhumanism. So if we look at this quote, we can see that inhumanism is not something non-human or anti-human. It's something that in a manner appreciates our inherent sense of self-preservation, and it does this through a historicized view of humanity, from our broadest, physical, biological, socioeconomic sense of self. Inhumanism is an incredibly dense topic, and you don't even have to look at it within the framework of Western humanism. I'm just doing that for the purpose of today, because I'm going to be looking at the work of Sylvia Wynter, along with the work of Patricia Reed and also Catherine McKittrick. So if we begin by talking about the emergence of European humanism, this is where a transition takes place between the medieval and spiritual, what Sylvia Wynter, as we'll see, describes as man one, towards rationalism and empiricism. This is what Sylvia Wynter describes as man two. So the story goes is that when this existential trajectory of man was placed upon his shoulders, this was done so that the earth and its universe would be bent to his will. Taking this as a starting point, not to say that what we're dealing with now is the tail end of a process that's outside our recent history, but in fact that the cultivation of solutions to the crisis of our time, it requires a sober realization of the human subject, as Negrestani states, one that understands our socio-economic sense of history. Reason itself can be a mode of thinking that works towards a tall order, but a non-anthropocentric, deliberately decentered self-understanding, one that might even incentivize towards designing new financial mechanisms that might avoid this collapse that we keep reading about. If we take the emergence of humanism as both a historic and political category, we can determine that humans have become, amongst other modes of being, and it's important to emphasize that it's amongst other modes of being, but that we are fundamentally metabolic economic units. If I were to stake my claim here simply, it's that if a non-economic conception of the human cannot be realized at this point in history, then we must be open to a kind of socio-cultural geoengineering with this concept of the human in mind. At least from the point of view of the financial system, that hierarchically dominant part of the planet's cartography, humans are an economic category, a unit. But a key point of what I'm trying to get across here today is that this unit is in no way, shape, or form homogeneous in its function and value in any given economic or ecological system. This problem of the attempted reduction of our complexity within nature is a problem that has many historical focal points we can look at, and one that's analysed by Sylvia Wynter takes a jump-off point here of the year 1492. So the philosopher Sylvia Wynter, and I'm going to be drawing on her work quite a bit today, she states that the modelling of our existence through technicity of capital would not have been possible without the foundational construction of the economic conception of being human. This is what I mean when I say that climate collapse, or projected climate collapse, from the viewpoint of humans and their mode of being is a fundamentally economic problem. This becomes tangible if we look at what agents actually have major swing in policy and regulation. For example, insurance companies who stand to lose in climate collapse hold much more weight in the narrative of capital and growth than any group of activists ever could, really. The same could be said for banks and their financial interests. Banks work quite interestingly work quite different to fossil fuel companies in that the stakes are different. Fossil fuel financing accounts for only about 7% of JP Morgan Chase's lending and underwriting, whereas a company like ExxonMobil have all their eggs in one basket, as it were. With this in mind, reforestation and geoengineering and degrowth, these are all, absolute necessities, but unless the existing financial system is re-engineered to divert its interest towards green energy, along with different models of value engineering, then paper straws, recycling, carbon credit markets, etc., these just aren't going to cut it. If we think about individualism as a pathology, this emergence of the anthropocentric self-affirmation that has come to define the Western identity since World War II, this is actually something that has its roots much earlier in the planet's trajectory. There are several points of history this can be traced back to. Sylvia Wynter cites 1492 as the beginning of a cognitive shift rooted towards a Western humanist self-affirmation that was then and is still now performed as being for all of humanity. Yet in its development, it redirects the distribution of its benefits and legitimizes the violence it propagates. In the 15th century, movements of European colonialism and humanism, these mark the emergence of what Wynter calls Man One. And that was tied to the theological order of knowledge of pre-Renaissance Latin Christian medieval Europe. But more importantly, for what I'm speaking about today, is this emergence of Man Two, a figure based on the Western bourgeoisie's model of being human that since the 19th century can be described as liberal monohumanism's Homo economicus. So we can think of these figures as being the product of knowledge systems and origin stories that not only explain but actually determine who we are. Catherine McKittrick even goes as far as to say that these knowledge systems signal the processes through which empirical and experiential lives of all humans are increasingly subordinated to a figure that thrives on accumulation. Sylvia Wynter herself described the plantations instantiated by European colonialism as constituting the emergence of a dominant logic. A key point here when talking about knowledge systems is that with evolution comes culture, and with culture comes cultural logic. With cultural logics come fields of knowledge, ones that will compete constantly, and through this there will always be some form of othering, some dominant cultural logic. We see knowledge systems like this playing out today. So in May 2019, following guidance from the International Commission on Stratigraphy, the Anthropocene Working Group formally declared that we are in fact living in an age that can be defined as the Anthropocene, although there's a lot of different ideas as to when that started. But the thing with stratigraphic labeling is that it is itself a political strategy that negates exactly what human activities have resulted in the current state of the planet's ecosystem. There's another later point in history which can also be thought about in relation to the year 1492 and this emerging lineage of the Anthropocene. That's the year 1610. So the year 1610 was the lowest point in a decades-long decrease in atmospheric carbon measurable by traces found in the Arctic ice cores. According to climate scientists Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin, this change in atmosphere was caused by the death of over 50 million indigenous residents of the Americas in the first century after European contact. This was the result of exposure to diseases carried by Europeans, war, enslavement, famine, and the knock-on effect of that being that there was a sharp decrease in farming, fire burning, and other human activities. And it also needs to be considered that the bringing of plant and animal species from Europe into a different ecosystem, accelerating the extinction of many existing species, this has been done in the name of progress. Things like progress and growth are the ultimate knowledge systems of our time. The normalization of narratives that would favor the kind of genocide we've seen in ecosystems in relation to human beings, it's not outside the realms of possibility in the age we live in. And it would be fair to argue that this process is already underway with this overarching narrative of the Anthropocene. So I think it's fair to say that the Anthropocene is a dominant cultural logic of the age we live in. History cannot be greenwashed, and the economic restructuring required to tackle collapse cannot be anachronistic or ahistorical either. The crisis we find ourselves in, one way or another, is man-made, made by a certain type of man, a particular branch of man that is pathologically parasitic. In the paradigm of Homo economicus that Sylvia Wynter describes, you are what you do, basically, not who you are. Strangely enough, this current dominant cultural logic would suggest that it's actually through us that the autonomous macrosystem of the Earth now has the potential to rein us in for good and restabilize itself. You could even go as far as to say, who the hell are we to stop this process? But that would be an anti-humanist position, not an inhuman one. If we could scale back certain layers of modernity, which climate change could inevitably force upon humans eventually anyway, then interestingly, you can possibly reduce the amount to which the being of being human is an economic category. This could be taken as a prime argument for degrowth. We have this problem, though, with simulated collectivity. It's definitely a 21st century problem. But we live in a reality where we are further atomized with every step of growth in modernity. Potentially there is a remedy for this in some form of radical mode of governance, though the likelihood of this happening isn't something that gives me too much hope. Because what this would require is a politics of truth, verifiability, and accountability, and that's something that's not, it doesn't fit well within modernity. It didn't fit well within medieval times either. It arguably hasn't existed yet. But what is more concerning, perhaps, is that while the leftist intelligentsia of panels, not unlike this one I'm doing here, they discuss continually about things like modes of being and decolonizing institutions, when little of what they talk about seems to come to much fruition outside of their own bubble. Sylvia Wynter's evaluation of Foucault's episteme, the episteme being the discursive backdrop of any given history, asserts that knowledge is something that is given, something controlled, and that it is something that facilitates a sociality that enables, and this is important, survival, well-being, and stable reproduction of the mode of being human that each ruling group embodies and actualizes. We come back to this point of the dominant cultural logic. It would seem that given current projections of ecological collapse, that the current mode of being, Homo economicus, is not a mode of being that is enabling survival or well-being or stable reproduction. Reproduction is actually interesting to note here because population growth has actually decelerated autonomously without need for governance, ecofascism, or enforced sterilization. If the crisis we face is one of economics, then the mobility required to change this lies in regulation. We can view this regulation as a form of technology, a technology that needs to break the cultural set. So this kind of regulation I'm talking about here can be thought of in relation to the tax system. In the US, dividends are taxed like normal income, but growth in stock value is taxed at the capital gains rate. People in the highest tax bracket pay 37% on dividends, but only 20% on stock value growth. So changing the tax policy such that dividends are taxed either the same or less than capital gains would theoretically change the incentive of growth over profitability. And what do we mean when we talk about this kind of growth that you do see in the US? Well, it's done through things like maximizing operations, doing the same thing for less money, offshoring, moving operations to where there's cheaper labor, reducing the cost of sales, so decreasing wages and restructuring. These are all the things that are done to prioritize shareholder value. If government has any purpose at all, it is to regulate this. So we want governance, but we want the right kind. As many modes of governance we see today don't currently operate well, even from the protocol level. And we can take an example actually from fiction here to parse this point out a little bit. This point of the disparity between the state's intentions and the results of those intentions. It's described quite well by the fictional Iranian archaeologist Dr. Hamid Parsani. So this quote should be considered in light of Keller Easterling's concept of extra statecraft. The idea that it's not people but infrastructure that set the rules for governance. And this infrastructure can, of course, result in unintended consequences. This could be described as humans not only having invented culture or technology, but actually having been themselves invented by it. Gary Tomlinson's very good on this also. The strategic weapon that Parsani speaks of could be Easterling's interpretation of the free zone, with its tax exemptions, foreign ownership of property, deregulation, and specifically relative to this project, environmental provisions. Since we're tracing things like strategic weapons and epochs throughout history, we can even say that the construction of the social order itself is a kind of strategic weapon. Part of the protocol for Western humanism has been the cognitive construction of the social order, creating a veil of cohesion in order to support both governance and growth. Jean Baudrillard describes this in his concept of the hypersocial, an idea that a consensus is acceptable, or a consensus in acceptable social relations implies that there is a reality principle, produced by a centralized perspectival space, often done by government, which is instrumental in constructing an effective meaning or truth. So the social was and still is the network of exchange value for the human as an economic category. A simple case study for this theorization is the emergence of the mediated social network, as these are the means by which the social is absorbed into capital, the human and its sociality then become reconfigured as a process of circulation, always secured, allegedly, by network protocols. What must be realized is that it's still possible to construct a social without society, or a social media that exists outside of society and its specular economy, and that perhaps this is what will be necessary in order to create a state of solidarity without homophilia, as Patricia Reed has described. It's not even the case that we must desire this, but that it actually might become a necessity in the face of right-wing populism, that movement that rails against adaptability and, most importantly, accountability. Perhaps as growth is potentially unavoidable in some cases, then we want the right kind of growth, right? Edward O. Wilson has actually got quite an accelerationist view on this, but it's one which I'm skeptical of. But according to him, product design is moving in a favorable manner. Given the success of products that cost less to manufacture, advertise, they need less frequent repair and replacement, and give the highest performance with a minimum amount of energy, effectively raising the benefit to cost of production and driving the evolution of the economy. This is what he describes as the transition from 20th century extensive growth to 21st century intensive growth. So we've seen this kind of faith in efficient exponential growth and production before, actually, with the advent of German forestry science, which has been beautifully analysed by the anthropologist James C. Scott. So important in this example is that the German model for forestry science was adopted as a standard in British colonies, where the humanist ideals of recent history would actually begin to rot and contaminate. This is just one example of humanism as a hegemony of failure. So in the 19th century, German forestry becomes streamlined, making the mass-produced new softwood forest producers of a single product line, simplifying forestry into a one-commodity machine, a mode of efficiency that could be codified and taught, the same as urban planning and rural resettlement. So this is a blueprint that failed to take into consideration that which was outside the realms of understanding. Soil is an interesting metaphor for the schemes that man envisions for progress, as soil, which naturally provides, is itself the original form of capital. The metaphorical value of this account of scientific production forestry is that it conveys the dangers of trying to streamline an exceptionally complex and poorly understood set of relations and processes in order to isolate a single element of instrumental value. If we take this idea of the human as an economic unit, in light of refashioning of complex ecology of forests as commodity machines, it is possible that we actually have a better understanding of the human and its relations to environments, but we don't know that yet. As metabolic economic units, perhaps in our groupings we do not have the complexity and sophistication of forests, but this is just something that's unknown at this point. Like forests, though, homogeneity is not good for us. Monocultures, such as monohumanism, are more fragile and prone to collapse than polycultures. Scott has argued it is in this spirit that, like the complexities of nature in its raw form, the raw social patterns of human interaction in relation to nature are incomprehensible. The same can be said for capital as a dominant cultural logic. This begs the question, which complexities are easier to navigate, as our relationality is not something that has one fixed state? If it is impossible for state agents to understand the entirety of social reality, then abstractions and simplifications like this must be taken as something dangerous. It's questionable as to how we could assume that shifts towards an intensive form of growth like Edward Wilson has described could be benign and productive, given what we can now observe in the history of forestry and projected timelines of climate collapse. So, to close this out, I'd like to talk a little bit about this thing called pre-order. So the concept of the human as economic unit can be kind of spun out a bit more by Shimson Bichler and Jonathan Nitzan's concept of pre-order. So their idea is that capital is not just machines and production lines and their offspring, but perhaps more concretely, a representation of the organized power of dominant groups to create order in any given society. Capital is a dominant cultural logic that's inextricably linked to the Anthropocene. And in this logic, anything other than equilibrium is disequilibrium. It's important not to take the human as an economic unit or util on an individual level. That would be a mistake. But we have to take it as a codification of macro-level value. The human as economic unit requires something that's missed in that Marxist idea of value, that the description of the human as a desire machine as simply the sum of biological urges, that reductively negates that if we can isolate the human as an interface on that surface level, then the human can be taken as a transitionary genre of being that is metabolic currency. A reconfiguration of the self, as argued by Sylvia Wynter, is something that exists outside of biology, perhaps requiring a conception of self reduced not to biological urges, not to our genetic function, but to that of a transitionary cultural product of util. This position is not reductive. It does not take biology as a given or ignore its complexity, but it takes the human itself in its totality as an empirical domain of knowledge and processes, ones that are still being mapped out and will forever be mapped out, but not in a way, hopefully, that blindly moves through self-affirmation towards a tragic endgame.